Today's episode of Transform Your Workplace is brought to you by Xenium HR. Do you want to get real, honest feedback from your employees? Well, you're in luck because Xenium's launching its What People Want from Work survey. This is an annual survey. It's free to participate. This is an anonymous online survey that we facilitate at Xenium. We ask your employees 32 questions that reveal what they really value and want from you as their employer, their team, their workplace, and in their job. We use a combination of multiple choice questions and fill in the blank answers, and we do all the analysis and provide a free report for you in the end so you can figure out what people want from work. Learn more at xeniumhr.com, and a link is in the show notes to participate. All right, today's guest is Dr. Suzanne Wertheim. We're discussing her book, The Inclusive Language Field Guide. Dr. Wertheim is a linguistic anthropologist, and this makes her the perfect person to talk about how language is constantly changing and how we can stay up to date so we can communicate with our colleagues, friends, family, and anyone we run across, and so that we can engage in meaningful and respectful conversations. This episode is definitely a must listen for anybody who's looking to communicate more effectively in the future. Make sure to connect with Dr. Wertheim on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn as well. Love connecting with listeners and hearing how you're liking the show. Enjoy today's conversation with Dr. Suzanne Wertheim. Dr. Suzanne Wertheim, thanks for coming on Transform Your Workplace.
Thank you so much for having me. I am really genuinely delighted to be here.
I'm probably more delighted than you are because I have not covered this topic. I've done diversity, equity, inclusion podcasts before, never something specific to inclusive language. You wrote a book, an incredible book that's very helpful. I'm going to try to cover the highlights of it in this conversation. And if people want to go deeper, of course, go buy the book. But it's called The Inclusive Language Field Guide, 6 Simple Principles for Avoiding Painful Mistakes and Communicating Respectfully. So maybe just give me a quick little background on what led you to write this book in the first place. Did you feel like nobody has come out with anything this comprehensive, quite frankly?
Well, there are 2 reasons. The second one's going to be a little more academic-y, and the first one is more about HR professionals, right? So what happened is I have a lot of HR stakeholders, VP of people, head of HR, who would bring me in to do trainings of different kind, anti-bias training, what's happening in the workplace. And more I was getting requests for stuff that was language specific. Not a surprise, because for a long time I was a professor of something called linguistic anthropology, and I've got a PhD in linguistics. So if you're going to ask somebody to come in and talk about language in a scientific way, I'm going to be your go-to, right? And so what happened is HR people kept on saying to me, it all makes sense when you're here, and then you go and people ask me questions and I can't really answer them. I need you here when you're not here. I need you to write a book that I can just buy for my people managers, buy for people with questions, hand it out and give to them. So that was the top reason. It's genuinely HR led me to write the book. The other reason, which is a little more scientific, is because I come from my background, I actually approach the topic of language that's respectful, up to date, modern, fits modern etiquette from a different angle than literally everybody else that I've been reading. A lot of people will start with identity and say, there's this kind of person, and here's the problems that they've faced, and so we can't use these words. But especially because I've got global clients, sometimes American factors don't really play in. Here we think a lot about race. Well, in India, it's not really race, it's caste. Or in Turkey, it's maybe immigrant status, right? There are so many places where American concepts and words don't apply, even if people are speaking English. So I went and I decided that it needed to be from a behavior perspective and not an identity perspective. And because luckily enough, I'm a person who has lived in multiple countries, studied multiple languages, lived in multiple languages. And because I was coming from anthropology, I had access to so many people's data. I could put together something that was global and globally applicable and started from universals of human behavior. And I honestly didn't see anybody else doing that. So I'm like, well, I guess I'm the one to write this book. And then I did. Then I wrote it.
Well, I appreciate that background because what I'll tell you is I'm not an English major. I don't know the science behind all this stuff. What I can tell you is that I know that the language is constantly evolving. We're adding new words to the dictionary all the time. The meaning behind things is changing. I want to be kind and respectful to people. That is where I'm coming from. I am here to learn. And so I'm going to just set the stage with that because I know there's a lot of people that feel the same way as me. They want to be kind and respectful to others. We know that language is changing quite a bit, or it just needs to catch up with society and where we're at. And I think there's a lot of people afraid to be canceled, if you will, like on social media. Like that's a thing, especially with famous people. And I think people tiptoe around on language because they don't know what they don't know, and that's why you're here, right?
It is. And I definitely use carrot and stick with my audiences. So, carrot is, don't you want to be up to date? I know you're a good person with good intentions. Don't you want to have your words work for you and not accidentally be dragging old fashioned, antiquated meanings that you don't actually want to be using? And then there's the stick, which is like, oh my God, everybody can be watching you at any given moment. People can screenshot your text message. People can take your all hands footage and throw it out on the internet. I mean, people can take your whatever, like it's so quick for the internet to come and judge you. So that's another thing is people, especially I work with tech a lot. And my dad was an engineer. My brain is half engineer. I went in a different direction, but I understand this desire. People are almost pleading with me. They're like, can you just give me a list of words I can memorize? Like, I want this list of bad words and this list of good words. I'm like, A, context is everything. And B, it might change. I can give you a list. Well, what if it changes within a year? So I set up with these principles, which we probably should get into at some point, but I set up with the principles. So people, they're a guardrail. They're not just a way for you to judge your own language and do them like a pilot safety checklist. Am I doing this? Am I doing this? Am I doing this? Okay, it should be safe. But they're also a way for you to have a meaningful, directed, safe conversation with someone who maybe has information that you don't have that you could use. You can just go through the principles and be like, well, is the word problematic this way? Is it this way? And it can guide people to a safe and respectful conversation that also doesn't use language that people tend to get very resistant. I was very careful in the book. I'm never saying to people, say to somebody, that's racist, that's homophobic, that's sexist. When you say things like that to somebody, they shut down, they get defensive, they feel attacked. Your body floods with stress chemicals. You can't
Labels them too. It's like a
Yeah, you can't learn. It's not an incentive to change behavior. But if you say, "Oh, this word that you used, it actually erases people." You might not know that, but let me give you an example of how you think you're reflecting everybody, but actually you're not actually pointing to everybody. You're erasing some people. Then people feel like it's accessible. Like, oh, it's not that I'm a jerk. Just this word had baggage that I didn't expect. And I'm going to shift over to a new way of talking. So my goal is always for people to feel more confident, more empowered, less afraid. Because if you're afraid, you're going to be stuck and you're not going to be able to do the work. And then you get further and further behind.
right. Is there a story or example that might illustrate why you wrote this book in the first place? Like common language that somebody might use that's rooted from the past where it needs to change?
Sure. And apologies in advance to the audience because everybody gets upset when I say this, but it's guys. So it's hey guys and it's you guys.
I'm guilty of that. I'm very guilty of this.
I have seen a very out lesbian woman moderating a panel of women who kept on saying, hey guys, and then like jerking backwards herself. Yeah, because it's just, there are actually linguistic reasons why it's hard to get rid of that are in my dissertation that I don't have time to talk about here. But so let me tell you from the perspective of HR, I've been brought in to do so many employee experience interviews, either while people are still at a company or sometimes companies are like, we're hemorrhaging people that I don't think we should be hemorrhaging. Like we keep on losing women, we lose people of color, any combination of that. So I'll go and I'll do a exit interview. I think we all know that exit interviews often don't actually give you the information that you need as to why somebody left. But if you bring in an intermediary who can interview people professionally and then hide who they are and disguise some of the things and then report back to a company and say, here are some pain points. Here's a leaky bucket. You got to plug it. A lot of the times what I was finding, it was language. That's why I incorporated things into the book. And multiple people have reported to me in these interviews that they have a manager who's nice or somebody who's nice, but there's a combination of reasons why they don't feel seen or respected or valued in the company. And somehow having meetings where they're being referred to as guys all the time and they're either female or non-binary is that extra jab that makes them feel so bad. And it feels like this illustration of when you're picturing someone doing good work, you're only picturing a man. So I'm sorry. People will try to say to you, guys represents everybody, but there are linguistic tests that show it really doesn't.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a couple of weeks ago I was in a virtual call with a couple colleagues of mine, both women, and I said, hey you guys, or what's up you guys, like, stuff like that. And I probably said it multiple times, and I did catch myself afterwards. I'm like, what is a better way of saying this? And maybe you can help me with that.
So one thing is sometimes people want a one-to-one substitution. Guys is such a useful word, and it really permeates our speech for reasons that are very linguistic-y, but they're about, I don't know. We do a lot of things with our speech when we want to draw people's attention to something, or we want to collect their attention or point to a thing. And there are these fancy words. There's a fancy class of words, and it fits in that fancy class of words that is very, very hard to remove. So I guess I'm going to get weirdly about my dissertation, which is so long ago, but there were speakers of a minority language who felt so angry at how many majority language words were being shoved in their language by the authoritarian dictatorship kind of government, right? They were so upset. So they would try to speak a very pure way by removing all the words. And guess what? Words like guys are the ones that stayed in. Even people who are actively trying, I don't want these words in my language, they would still come in. And for me, that's proof that even when you're really trying to remove it, this is the kind of stuff that can sneak through. So it's really hard. One thing is you can say things like, hey, everyone, or hey, team, or hey, folks. I would say that you probably have to have a repertoire, because if you use a word that's like guys but isn't, it's going to sound strange. If you're always like, hey folks, hey folks, hey folks, hey you folks, I think people will look and be like, why is Brandon so obsessed with the word folks these days? Whereas guys goes under the radar except for people who it's offending, right? So I generally say to people, get 3 or 4 words and practice switching them out. Hey everyone, it's time to start the meeting. All right, you all, what do you think about this? Okay, people, let's move to this, right? And so when it's that attention drawing time, you've got a little suite of things, and you probably have to practice doing it, but you can't do a one-to-one substitute for guys because guys is just so useful. It's such a bummer that it's so problematic.
Suzanne, what are some of the dimensions of human identity that we should take into consideration when it comes to inclusive language? You got a great section in this book, and I thought maybe you'd highlight a few of those.
Sure. So I think of inclusive language as really reflecting reality. And reality is that's why it's my first principle. Reality is that people come in all kinds of flavors, right? There are so many different ways that we can sort people into different kinds of groups. And sometimes they're going to be more meaningful than other times. So in the book, I think I give an example of religion may not play a role when you're running a meeting, but it is going to play a role when you're working on the holiday calendar and scheduling things, right? Like you don't want to do, as someone was just telling me about, a celebration luncheon honoring people during Ramadan, right? So like that's a bad one if that was in your calendar. But if you're just running an inclusive meeting, religion shouldn't be playing a role. So there are the standard ones that are like in this country, in the US where I am, race and ethnicity are tippy top, as are gender, male, female, and now people are talking more about people who don't fit in that binary. Sexual orientation is another big one. People have been non-binary. People have been other than heterosexual for as long as people have existed. As long as we have recorded documentation of human behavior, we have examples of people talking in ancient Sumerian, I believe, about non-binary people, about sexual behavior that's not heterosexual, right? These kinds of people, there's so many ways that people can show up. People have showed up with abilities and disabilities forever, right? So there are ways that sometimes people think like it's modern or it's like people, the way that people are always the same. Human beings like to sort ourselves according to class. Like we love to have people who are higher and lower. It's less fun when you're lower. There are just so many ways. Socioeconomic class is one people don't think about a lot. maybe in HR, people do more parental status. I find that people who are journalists or who are writing advertising often forget to think about parental status. They don't think about veteran status. So there are ways that we show up in the world in our bodies that we can sort ourselves out. There are ways that we interact with other people that allow us to sort ourselves out. So what languages you grew up speaking? Are you an immigrant? Or did you grow up in a country? Are you indigenous? Like there are so many ways. And so that's why in the book, I lay them out. And then I even have a checklist at the end for people creating comms or documents that are meant to be read by a wide range of people. And I see them as like a pilot safety checklist. If I don't see that pilot with a clipboard going around, I was just flying twice last week. And I'm like, oh, clipboard, like we're good, right? We're good. I feel like all comms before they take off should have this safety checklist where you can go and be like, have I forgotten about somebody? Ooh, can I give a good example? Speaking of being canceled, can I give a good example of a comms team and an executive that forgot, that didn't have this kind of awareness of how to go through?
Yeah, I would love that.
So, because I think it's a great example of an executive who didn't use one bad word. And if you Google his name, which is Gary Pilnick, the first things you find is the biggest hit to his brand reputation. It is a series of article headlines lambasting him, saying terrible things about him. So he is CEO of Kellogg, and he went on CNBC. Yep, he went on CNBC, and he was just being asked to talk about the marketing campaign. And he's like, well, people are poorer these days, or people are feeling a struggle. He didn't even say anything. He didn't say like, poor people are, he used sort of careful language. And he's like, poor people are having problems getting food. And so we're running this new marketing campaign saying, try cereal for dinner. And it's landing really well, right? And so this is why one of the things I say is, why can't you do a list of good and bad words? Because context is everything. And if you are having budget issues and you're talking with your neighbor, like, I can't figure out how to make the grocery budget stretch. And your neighbor says to you, you know what? I'm treating the kids to cereal once a week for dinner. It's more affordable. It's a treat. It feels like fun. We can really stretch the budget. That is one thing. And when a rich white guy who runs a corporation that has been increasing their prices and shrinking their packaging over the course of the pandemic stands there and says, hey, poor people, have you considered cereal? They're literally comparing it to the French Revolution and Marie Antoinette saying, let them eat cake, which, by the way, she never said it. But so this is what I'm saying. If his comms people creating what he's going to say on this TV show had my checklist where they go and socioeconomic class, are we taking into account socioeconomic class when we're crafting this message? I think they probably could have caught themselves and said, hey, that might not land well.
That's a great example. Thanks for sharing. I remember hearing that, and I was like, that is very out of touch. And I didn't read all the articles about it, but I just remember thinking like, oh, wow, that it's going to basically alienate an entire group of people that probably use the product.
And it's just, and the thing is like, and people are also very sensitive to people who are genuine and are genuinely trying to do better or help or be helpful, and people who are only doing things because they want credit or they want money. They feel like it's going to be a benefit to them, right? And so I think there are ways that sometimes people use words because they think it'll make them look more appealing or like they get it. But if you don't really understand why a word is being used in a certain way, it can really lead to, I don't have a great example offhand, but people can feel when you're an intruder into their space, and they can feel like a youth pastor using slang, and then people are like, oh my God, please don't. It's so embarrassing. Or a parent to a teenager using slang. They're like, please don't use that. If you don't know why a word is being used the way that it is, if you're not fluent in it, there's a good chance that the people who are fluent in the word are going to pick up on it and be like, ooh, this is not sitting right. Like, why are you here? And I don't trust you.
So you're saying I shouldn't repeat the word slay like my daughter does, who's 10 years old?
If you don't like them saying it, it's one of the fastest ways to get them to stop is to adopt slang. And then it's so uncool. It's the worst thing. But I'm not. This is a tip for your listeners.
I'm partially joking there. So you talked about one of the principles. Can you list off all the 6 principles real quick? We're going to get into some of that, and it's going to be like kind of embedded throughout the conversation.
Sure. So my 6 principles, which are applied to all languages and all cultures that I found, they're designed to be universal, are Inclusive language reflects reality, shows respect, draws people in, incorporates other perspectives, prevents erasure, and recognizes pain points. And that's it. I think everybody, if you hear that, you're like, well, yeah, that's how I want people to speak to me. It's as basic as that. Having said that, it gets very complicated when you, like, there are many things that are very basic as principles. You can list them out. You're like, that's so simple. And then when you try to implement, you're like, oh, maybe not so simple. So
There's this point that you made in the chapter about move beyond the dictionary. You said language is like fungus. What did you mean by that?
I mean that for a long time, people thought that you could study language in isolation. Like people who study fungus felt like you could pick up a mushroom and study it in a lab and learn things. But it turns out that recent scientific research says what's amazing about fungus is that all the stuff that you don't see, these incredibly tangled roots that talk to other funguses, talk to trees. I mean, there are fungi that connect trees, and when the fungus disappears, then the forest doesn't do so well, right? So words are like that too. Dictionaries try to give you a little bit of context. They give you those example sentences, right? But they don't give you enough context. And what I'm saying is, if you don't have an understanding of the context and why a word might be okay for one group of people and not okay for another group of people, or it might be okay for one person to say in a certain situation and not another situation, it doesn't work. So you have to move past the dictionary and say, I got to learn more about context. And that's where those dimensions of identity start to come in.
What are some common linguistic missteps that leaders might not be aware of, but that undermine respect of the people that they serve?
That's a good question. I mean, I definitely work with executives and they don't love hearing things that I say. I'm like, you should do better, basically.
We're all trying to learn. And I think this is why I asked this question.
Let me give you a kind of a complicated one.
Okay.
This is why I'm talking about behaviors and not just words, right? There's this interesting thing that happens to your brain and your vagus nerve as you move up the ladder, either in terms of social status or economic status, socioeconomic status. And they run research, they run experiments on people. In just 20 minutes, they can convince people that they're fancy and then get the same results. And what happens is, as you become fancier, you get rewired to be less empathetic. You literally are less empathetic. But also it becomes harder to hear people when they're not being really direct with you. But there's this thing in American speech and many other places where if you are reporting up to somebody, you don't feel allowed to be direct with them. You can't say to them, no, that doesn't work, or I disagree, and especially it's amplified where I've got an example I use in workshops all the time, where if somebody expresses dissent and they are like a woman of color, a man of color, a perceptibly disabled person, and they say, oh, I think this is a mistake, we should fix it, people get angry at them for calling out the problem. So there's this problem that leaders have where they have to do extra work to make it safe for people to talk to them. They have to do extra work to draw people in and make sure that they're heard. They have to do extra work to make sure that they are respectful of other people's opinions. And people fall into these traps so often. And so I was talking about those exit interviews I do. Well, a company that's hemorrhaging white women, women of color, men of color, disabled people, again and again and again, it's that they weren't treated with respect, meaning people didn't hear their ideas or they were interrupted or talked over. And they weren't drawn in. Instead, they were pushed out. They weren't invited to the meeting. People didn't invite them to speak. People didn't hear them when they spoke. And it was death by 1,000 cuts. It happened again and again and again. And if leaders don't create a culture where you reset how it works and really work to be mindful to make sure that everybody is being drawn in, everybody who's competent, right? People were being pushed out, not because they weren't competent. They were being pushed out just because of who they are when they showed up, right? So you have to make it so that when people are trying to contribute to a work situation, you're not falling into these antiquated traps where only a certain person's voice is important, whether that's an executive's voice, so an executive who runs a meeting and then nobody gets to say anything, or whether it's a white man's voice, because in this country, we're told that the most important people are white people and the most important people are male people. And this is not to say I'm not here to complain about men. I'm not here to complain about white people. I'm not here to complain about white men. Some of my favorite relatives are white men. My partner is a white man. What I'm saying is the behaviors that say that one kind of person is to be always at the center and always put on the pedestal and always heard most leads you to companies that do not thrive, that are not as innovative, that lose people prematurely, that it's hard to recruit people into because you lose ideas when you lose the people and when people can't be heard. So that was kind of complicated, but it's the problem I'm trying to solve the most with the teams that I work with. So
Yeah, that's why I asked it, because I'm sure people who are listening to this conversation, who listen to our show, they're probably struggling with this as well. So I'm trying to bring everything to the surface here. In each of the chapters, you offer a lot of quick wins, which I love because it kind of summarizes the concepts, but also like gives you some tools to be able to take back to your workplace. In terms of showing people respect, what are some like super simple things that anybody could do that would help them win in this area?
So, one practice that people sort of scoff at because it feels obvious, but is so important is names. And so I want to give you props because you did the recommended thing before we started. You said, I want to make sure I've got your name right. And then you said that not only did you pronounce it correctly? And I'm like, oh, because people mispronounce my first name all the time. People mispronounce my last name all the time. People spell my first name wrong all the time. People spell my last name wrong all the time. And you said, I went to LinkedIn and I listened to the recording you made of your name, right? And so I am an example of somebody who I felt so respected and I felt so warmly towards you because you did that extra 2 minutes of work, was it? Probably not even 2 minutes of work, literally can be accounted for in seconds. And suddenly you're coming in a respectful way. And so for people who have higher frequency names, I don't think they understand how frequent the disrespect is that is going to people with lower frequency names. So a lower frequency name can be like mine. It's an English name, Suzanne, but it's pretty low frequency. I was born in the peak year for Suzanne, and it went off a cliff ever since, right? So even the famous Suzannes, young people don't even know who they are. I'm like Suzanne Summers. They're like, what? I'm like, Three's Company. They're like, what's Three's Company? It's not. I don't. I used to be able to point to famous people, and now they're like, I don't know what we're talking about. So, but it's even worse when it's combined with being a foreign name, a name that isn't in English and has letters maybe that are, it could be a long name, or it could be a name that has sounds that English speakers don't usually pronounce. And I've heard so many horror stories of people, speaking of respect, showing respect to people and drawing them in, it's a 1-2. You don't really remove them from each other, right? They really are actually working in tandem all the time. There are people I've talked to who have names that are hard to pronounce for speakers of American English, who they find that their colleagues won't talk to them. They think because they're afraid to say their name, so they'll avoid eye contact and they'll scurry past them and they come into meetings. And so this is what I'm talking about. People are like, oh, names are so basic. I'm like, names and not saying people's names is driving people away, or not putting in the effort to really tell one foreign name from another. So in the book, I give an example. I don't even know how I found it. I felt so lucky. There's a computer scientist who's got a pretty standard South Asian first name and a pretty standard South Asian second name. And they're unusual for English, and the last name is rather long and they have a lot of A's in them. And he was talking to a colleague. He was a grad student. And he was talking to a colleague at a conference, and the colleague learned at that moment that this computer scientist, this grad student, had written 3 papers that he liked. Not 1, not 2, but 3. And this dude was first author, which for academia means it's really your work. Like, you're the one getting the most credit. And he said, if I had known that you were the author of all 3 of those, I would have been advocating for my department to hire you. Right? So literally, because this person hadn't been trained that it's important to pay attention to names, he had lost out on that this guy is a great computer scientist, and he lost out on a colleague. This grad student lost out at being at a prestigious university, literally because of not paying attention to names. So I am begging people, put in the effort. If your tongue can't make all the sounds, that's okay. Nobody expects it to you. If your ear can't hear all the sounds, that's okay. You just got to get as close as you can and be able to tell one foreign name from another.
It's crazy because my next question for you is going to be like about your section in drawing people in. how can that kind of language transform an organizational culture and performance? And it was like that example proves it. It's like didn't go the extra effort to respectfully like say somebody's name, so they just avoided them, lost out big time on whether collaboration, performance, teamwork, and that impacts performance at the end of the day. Insane.
I mean, and innovation and yeah, and teamwork. I mean, if people are afraid to talk to somebody else, or if people are being shut out, how are you going to possibly get the exchange of ideas, or even just building up the sense of safety or team dynamics that are necessary for things to happen? So I think people say to me after reading my book or a workshop, they're so surprised. They're like, I started out thinking this is too basic, and then I saw that there are really serious consequences, and then I remembered I think that happened here. So
you had a quote that I pulled out, and I wanted to get your response on it. So the quote says, "It is painful to not be seen, to be erased," end quote. Can you share some ways that inclusive language can prevent this from happening, where people don't feel like they're erased?
let's talk about gender and the ongoing erasure in English of people who are non-binary. So transgender, non-binary, intersex, there are lots of ways that people don't fit in to being either male or female. And by the way, even if people have a hard time accepting gender dysphoria and the idea that somebody is born into a body and it's not the body that they feel like they were supposed to be in, just from medical facts, almost 2% of humans have some biological component that's intersex, right? It can be physical, it can be chemical, it can be genetic, right? So just that alone, we got 2% of humans who need to be taken into account. Okay. So what I hear is that people, the gender binary is very sneakily throughout our English language, and it can show up in HR stuff all the time. Your husband or wife. You won't have to share a hotel room with someone of the opposite sex. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our Ramadan lunch, whatever. Like there's so many ways. And so for people whom it doesn't affect, it's under the radar. Nobody notices. But for people who it does affect, like I was talking to a transgender woman in the UK who rides trains a lot. And so she says that every stop, actually, they, but every single stop, the conductor would say, ladies and gentlemen, da 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 da. I'm not going to pretend to do an English accent, sorry. Or thank you. Like, you're welcome for not trying to do it. Every single stop of this train, this person was like, the conductor's not thinking about me as a passenger, not respecting me as a passenger, is only thinking about certain kinds of people. So if you change, I'll tell you, a lot of people I work with are afraid of sounding woke or sounding like not themselves, but a lot of substitutions you can make don't sound weird at all. So you can say, instead of husband and wife, you can say spouse or partner. Put that in benefits. Everybody who is non-binary, who has a non-binary partner, sees it, says, oh, they were thinking of me. This company values me, right? If you are at an event and the MC, the host, comes up and says, all right, everybody, we're going to start. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to join you. People feel bad. But if somebody says, esteemed guests or beloved people, or whatever it is, that there's no one substitute for that. You got to figure it out yourself. But people are like, oh, they didn't say that. Or people have told me when they have a manager who has switched away from saying, hey guys and you guys, it takes a while. But then suddenly, like a few months later, they're like, oh, I'm never offended by him saying you guys and hey guys. Like, he must really be thinking, he must really be making an effort and thinking, I have female reports and they're important to me, or I have non-binary reports and they're important to me. So these little changes that can sound perfectly normal will fly under the radar for many people, but for the people whom they affect, it kindles this warm feeling of, oh, I've been seen, and talk about loyalty and talk about, I like it builds so many good feelings and so many points with people. So and by the way, when you are doing the work to draw people in, it gives you so much leeway to make mistakes because people know you're putting in the effort and they know you've got good intentions. So if you slip up and you use the wrong pronoun, or if you slip up and say something, especially if you're a leader who has made it clear that they're open to constructive feedback, suddenly you've got a way to stay up to date without this list of good and bad words, because people feel safe to come and say to you, hey, Brandon, I think this thing slipped out during the meeting. I don't think you meant to say it, but you said Oriental, and we're not saying Oriental anymore. Instead, we're going to say Asian, or we're going to talk about the particular country. So, and here's why.
That's what's so challenging about like this discussion. And I know for myself too, like you're not necessarily raised a certain way, but you it's so ingrained in you. The language is so ingrained in you, whether it's how you're raised, your surroundings, your environment, what you pay attention to, the content you consume, all of that, right? So to me, there seems like there's an awareness factor that needs to happen. Like, so if I don't know that word is not okay anymore, how do I become aware of it? And then also, how do I retrain my brain or to catch myself to say I'm working on it, and so others also know like, hey, I'm working on this, that I'm trying to use more inclusive language. I know that's a lot to unpack, but maybe point me in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing is to not give yourself unrealistic expectations. And the problem is there's so much moral weight, and especially since 2020 and Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, when there was so much discussion of how bad it is to be treating people badly. There's so much guilt and shame and moral weight that people can be paralyzed with fear is one problem. Also, you can't have unrealistic expectations just because it's a language that you speak fluently. Inclusive language skills are language skills, and they are parallel to acquiring other language skills. So you wouldn't be mad at yourself if you read a book about French if you don't speak French, or if you read a book about Mandarin. So you read a book about Mandarin for 4 hours and you're like, oh, this book had so much information, you put it down. And then you're like, well, I should be speaking Mandarin fluently now. Like, no, that's not how it works. So one thing that I'm going to suggest to your listeners, to you, is commit to doing a little bit every week. Just like you develop muscles a little bit. I can't go out and run a marathon. I don't know that I could ever run a marathon. I'm very short and I'm all torso. So that's probably not going to work. But I have been a person who got into shape. I've been a person who's biked a lot, hiked a lot, done stuff. Did I start with a 13-mile, 2,000 elevation chain hike? No, I started small. And I built it up in a little bit over time. So my muscles got strong. That's how you do it. And that's why in the book, I don't just give the quick wins, but I designed it so that you can do every month. The book is secretly a 6-month course. I was a professor for such a long time, right? So the book is a 6-month course. And I'm like, here are the top 3 things in the US to focus on. Practice this once a week, do this every day, and do this 3 times a week. And I give you an agenda and you can put it in your morning routine, right? You wake up, you stretch, you meditate, you do push-ups, whatever you do. Throw this into, like, maybe while you're waiting for the coffee to brew, practice telling a story about a non-binary celebrity.
This has been so much fun, Suzanne. We hit little points, we jumped around, but I wanted to make sure that listeners had a glimpse into what's inside your book. There's so much good stuff, and I hope people go get it, because truly, like, if they want to evolve with the times of the language and to have work environments that are inclusive and take everybody into account, I think this is a really important book. So well done on it. What do you want to say in parting? I know you just kind of gave us a glimpse into how we could use the book, but maybe there's something else you want to share.
I mean, I want to say you can do it. You can do it. It just means retraining your mind to see things that it didn't see before. But I promise you can do it. Even if you weren't good at grammar in school, you can do it. Even if you are like, I don't understand language, you do understand language and you can do it. Even if you're autistic, it's going to be harder for you. You're going to have to get more explicit help from people, but you can do it. If you learned to speak English fluently, if you learned how to get hired at a company, if you figured out how to be appropriate enough to do that, you can acquire these skills too. It just takes some resolve to do it and the right tools and practicing a little bit every day. And within 6 months, you will look back and be like, I have all these new habits. I really changed. So you can do it.
You could do it. What's the best way to connect with you, Suzanne?
So a lot of people follow me on LinkedIn or connect with me on LinkedIn. And if you want to find me to talk about trainings or other things that I do, keynotes, you can reach me at SuzanneWertheim.com. If you can see my name, you can spell my name and then just go and you can find it.
My guest today has been Dr. Suzanne Wertheim, the author of the Inclusive Language Field Guide, 6 Simple Principles for Avoiding Painful Mistakes and Communicating Respectfully. Suzanne, it was an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
It was a joy to talk with you. Not everybody I talk with has read the book, so this was extra fun for me. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Zenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Zenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.